Washington, and Donald Trump knows it. Right now, Republican senators are openly rebelling. The Senate is preparing a vote that could strip Trump of his war powers. And for the first time ever, Trump is admitting he doesn't know how to stop them. This isn't just another political loss. This is a power collapse happening in real time. From secret phone calls and private meltdowns to a bipartisan revolt that's cutting Trump out of his own party. Tonight, we're exposing what's really happening behind closed doors, why Trump is panicking, and why this moment could permanently change the future of American politics. Stay with me because what you're about to hear explains everything. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Donald Trump is losing control. And this time it's not Democrats doing it. Republican senators are revolting. A war powers vote is closing in, and Trump has privately admitted he can't stop it. Phones are ringing, tempers are exploding, and power is slipping away faster than anyone expected. Tonight, we're pulling back the curtain on Trump's biggest fear, the Senate rebellion he never saw coming, and why this could mark the beginning of the end of Trump's grip on the Republican Party. This isn't noise. This is history unfolding. Mr. President, on NATO right now, it sounds like you are saying that you would potentially acquire Greenland by force. That would be a NATO country. The United, are you saying that? Would you do that? No, you're saying that, would you? No, you're telling me that that's what I'm going to do. You don't know what I'm going to do. So what are the options? Your network doesn't know either. The Danish foreign minister said that there's still fundamental differences after the meeting with Rubio and with the vice president. Are you willing to leave the NATO alliance in order to get what you want with Greenland? What are the options right now? Well, I wouldn't be telling you what I'm willing to do. Certainly, I'm not going to give up options, but it's very important. Greenland's very important for the national security, including of Denmark. And the problem is, there's not a thing that Denmark can do about it if Russia or China wants to occupy Greenland. But there's everything we can do. You found that out last week with Venezuela. There's everything we can do about things such as that. Not going to happen. So imagine this moment for just a second, because this is where everything starts to crack. A sitting president pacing behind closed doors, phone in hand, not calling allies, not rallying supporters, but frantically dialing Republican senators who are no longer picking up, because for the first time in a very long time, Donald Trump is publicly admitting something he almost never admits. He doesn't know how to stop them. And that quiet confession is far louder than any rally speech he's ever given. Because right now the Republican Senate is in open revolt, not against Democrats, not against the media, but against Trump himself. And at the center of this rebellion is a war powers resolution that threatens to do something Trump fears more than bad headlines. It threatens to legally limit his ability to use military force as a personal political weapon. And that's why the panic is real. That's why the pressure is relentless. And that's why this moment feels different, heavier, and far more dangerous for Trump than any scandal or indictment ever could. Because this isn't about optics. It's about control. And Trump's entire political identity has always been built on the illusion that he alone controls the room, controls the party, controls the narrative. And now that illusion is collapsing in real time as senators from his own party openly question not just his strategy, but his motives, his instincts, and his judgment. And the passage of this resolution, which now appears increasingly imminent, would represent a direct institutional rebuke of Trump's attempt to expand executive power through militarization, through endless conflicts framed as security, through vague threats dressed up as strength, and through the constant suggestion that only he can keep America safe if given unchecked authority. Because Trump has always understood something very clearly, even if he never articulates it. War, or the threat of war, concentrates power. It creates fear. It suppresses dissent. It rallies loyalty. And it allows a leader to blur the line between national interest and personal ambition. And that is exactly why this vote has him spiraling. Because it doesn't just block one potential military action. It challenges the entire architecture of his authoritarian instinct. The idea that he can act first and justify later, that Congress will fall in line, that Republicans will always choose him over principle. And that assumption is what finally breaks when figures like Rand Paul step forward, not quietly, not cautiously, but publicly and unapologetically, calling out the absurdity of Trump's justifications for military escalation, exposing the pretexts, dismantling the narratives, and doing it in a space Trump once believed belonged to him. Conservative media, conservative audiences, and conservative power brokers. And when Rand Paul goes on Joe Rogan's platform and calmly walks listeners through the logic, or lack thereof, behind regime change arguments in Venezuela, what he's really doing is something far more dangerous to Trump than opposition attacks ever could. He's showing Republicans that it's possible to oppose Trump without immediately losing relevance, without being erased, without being destroyed. And he does it by stripping the argument down to its core contradictions, asking, why drug? Trafficking suddenly becomes a justification for bombing another nation's capital. Why indictments written in Washington are treated as universal law. Why possession of weapons by foreign leaders is framed as criminal when the same logic would criminalize half of American gun owners. And with each question, the Trump narrative loses another layer of credibility because it becomes clear that this isn't about drugs. It isn't about cartels. It isn't even about Maduro. It's about pretext, about finding any excuse necessary to justify force. Because force creates leverage, and leverage creates dominance. And dominance is the only political language Trump has ever truly spoken, which is why Paul's reminder that Trump himself pardoned a convicted drug trafficker hits so hard because it exposes the moral flexibility at the center of Trump's arguments. Laws matter when they're useful, principles matter when they're convenient, and national security matters only when it can be weaponized for personal gain. And this is where the conversation turns darker because Trump's desire for militarization doesn't stop at foreign policy. It bleeds inward into domestic power structures, into the expansion of federal enforcement forces that operate with blurred accountability, and into the cultivation of fear as a governing tool where agencies like ICE are no longer framed as institutions serving public safety, but as symbols of authority, punishment, and loyalty. Instruments designed not to protect, but to intimidate, not to stabilize, but to demonstrate dominance. And Trump's obsession with projecting strength requires constant reinforcement through enemies, whether real or imagined, foreign or domestic. Because without an enemy, the strongman persona collapses. And that's why moments like his comments on Greenland matter so much more than they initially appear to. Because when Trump floats the idea of acquiring Greenland by force, then retreats into ambiguity, refusing to rule anything out. What he's really doing is testing the boundaries of outrage, measuring how much resistance he'll face, seeing whether fear can once again substitute for logic. But the response this time is different because world leaders push back, allies recoil, and even within his own party, the silence is deafening because threatening a NATO ally isn't just reckless, it's destabilizing. And Trump's attempt to frame it as a strategic necessity to counter China or Russia falls apart under even minimal scrutiny, especially when his actual record shows accommodation, hesitation, and outright deference toward those same powers when it suits him. And this contradiction becomes impossible to ignore as Senate Republicans begin acknowledging publicly what they once whispered privately, that Trump's calls don't carry the same weight anymore, that his pressure campaigns aren't working, that his threats no longer guarantee compliance. And when Senate leaders admit they're not sure they even have the votes to stop a war powers resolution from advancing, that's not procedural uncertainty, that's political erosion. Because Trump's entire brand is built on inevitability, the idea that resistance is futile, that opposition will eventually fold. And when that inevitability disappears, so does the fear that sustains it. And this erosion isn't limited to foreign policy. It's happening across the board. From health care subsidies to budget negotiations to transparency votes that Republicans once would have blocked without hesitation. And instead of rallying the caucus, Trump finds himself watching as bipartisan coalitions form explicitly in defiance of his priorities, undoing his budget cuts, rejecting his attacks on scientific research, restoring funding to institutions he sought to hollow out, and doing so with votes that send a clear message Trump can demand, but Congress doesn't have to obey. And that realization is seismic because power isn't just about authority, it's about expectation. And once lawmakers stop expecting consequences for defiance, the entire power structure shifts. And this is where the story becomes less about Trump's immediate losses and more about what they reveal about the future. Because when ideological debates emerge within MAGA itself about interventionism, about endless wars, about executive overreach, Trump suddenly becomes a liability rather than a leader, because ideology requires consistency and Trump has none. Ideology requires sacrifice and Trump offers none. Ideology requires belief in something larger than oneself, and Trump has never believed in anything beyond his own advantage. And as Republicans begin, even tentatively, to imagine a future beyond Trump, to consider electoral survival, to think about 2028, not as a coronation but as an open question, Trump's grip weakens further because the moment a political movement starts planning for life after its leader, that leader's power is already fading, and Trump did not expect that moment to arrive so soon. He did not expect his party to start imagining alternatives while he's still demanding loyalty. And that miscalculation may be the most revealing thing of all, because it shows that Trump's greatest weakness has always been the same. He assumes fear lasts forever. He assumes loyalty is permanent. And he assumes that power once gained sustains itself without renewal. And as this Senate revolt unfolds, as war powers are debated, as his authority is challenged not by protesters but by Republicans, the question is no longer whether Trump is losing control. It's how much he's already lost, and whether this moment marks the beginning of the end of his ability to bend the party to his will. Because once the spell breaks, it never fully returns. So is the argument that they want regime change, that these cartels are working with Maduro, and that's why we blow them up. That's sort of the argument. But I don't think the cartels and the drugs are really important. It's about regime change because, if it's about regime change, why blow up the drug boat? Because they need a drug predicate. They want to say this isn't war. It is kind of war, and we're going to take people as if it's war, but it's not really war. It was an arrest warrant. And they've actually persuaded some otherwise good people in my caucus to say, well, normally I would be against bombing another nation's capital and removing the leader. Oh, but he was indicted for the indictment. Most people don't know this. Part of the indictment is for drugs, but he's breaking a U.S. law. How do we indict foreigners in their country? They haven't broken a law in our country for breaking law. But other than drugs, they've also indicted Maduro for possessing or conspiring to possess machine guns. And here's where the tension thickens, because while the cameras stay fixed on podium statements and clipped sound bites, the real drama is unfolding in quiet hallways, private offices, and late-night phone calls where Donald Trump's voice no longer carries the unquestioned authority it once did. Because behind the scenes, Senate Republicans are doing something almost unthinkable in Trump-era politics. They are weighing their own political survival against his demands. And for the first time, many are choosing themselves. And that shift is subtle but unmistakable, revealed not through dramatic press conferences, but through hesitation, through delayed statements, through carefully worded non-answers when reporters ask the simplest question of all, how are you going to vote? Because hesitation is kryptonite to authoritarian power, and Trump senses it, which is why his response has been escalation rather than persuasion, pressure rather than coalition building, and intimidation rather than argument. As he personally begins calling senators who supported moving the war powers resolution forward, not to debate the merits, not to offer policy justification, but to remind them who he believes still controls the party. Yet those calls land differently now because the senators on the other end of the line are no longer junior backbenchers terrified of primary challenges. They are lawmakers staring down brutal midterm math, shrinking margins, and polling data that tells a clear story. Trump's endorsement doesn't guarantee safety anymore, and in some cases it's becoming a liability. And this reality is driving the quiet rebellion we're witnessing, because what looks like a procedural fight over a single resolution is actually a referendum on Trump's grip over the Republican Senate, and Senate leadership knows it, which is why they scramble for procedural maneuvers, technical delays, and parliamentary tricks. Not out of confidence, but out of fear of what a public defeat would symbolize. Because a war powers resolution passing, despite Trump's opposition, would mark one of the clearest institutional repudiations of his authority to date. a moment where Congress reasserts itself after years of surrendering power to the executive branch. And Trump understands that symbolism all too well, because his political rise has always depended on the perception that institutions bend for him, that rules become flexible around him, and that resistance is futile. And when that perception cracks, the entire structure wobbles, which is why he goes ballistic when even a handful of Republicans defect, because he knows numbers matter less than momentum, and momentum is slipping away. And you can see it in the way senators like Josh Hawley and Todd Young suddenly become central figures, not because of what they say, but because of what they refuse to say, declining to publicly commit, leaving Trump in limbo, forcing him to wait, to wonder, to guess. And that uncertainty is poison for a man who thrives on dominance, because uncertainty means he no longer controls the outcome, and control has always been his currency. And as this unfolds, it exposes a deeper truth about Trump's relationship with power. He doesn't build coalitions, he enforces loyalty. And loyalty enforced through fear only lasts as long as fear outweighs self-interest. And right now, self-interest is winning because Republicans are watching Trump rack up loss after loss, watching bipartisan coalitions override his priorities, watching Congress reverse his budget cuts, restore funding to science and research, and openly defy his attempts to hollow out institutions he views as inconvenient. And each of those defeats chips away at the myth of Trump as an unstoppable force, replacing it with a far more dangerous image for him. Trump as a declining asset, a leader whose threats no longer guarantee results. And that image terrifies him because it invites calculation, and calculation leads to defection, and defection leads to collapse. And nowhere is that more evident than in the way Republicans are now openly discussing ideology without centering Trump. Because for years, MAGA wasn't an ideology so much as a personality cult, a movement defined by loyalty to one man rather than a coherent set of principles. But now, cracks are forming as lawmakers revisit questions Trump once buried under slogans. Should America be involved in endless wars? Should presidents have unilateral authority to deploy force? Should foreign policy be driven by spectacle rather than strategy? And these questions matter precisely because they can't be answered by Trump's usual instincts. Because Trump doesn't believe in restraint, he believes in leverage, he doesn't believe in strategy, he believes in dominance. And when Republicans start debating interventionism versus isolationism, congressional authority versus executive power, they are implicitly sidelining Trump because he has nothing to contribute beyond threats and theatrics. And that sidelining is existential for him because Trump without the spotlight is Trump without power. And this ideological shift is being accelerated by electoral reality because Senate Republicans know the math is brutal. They know their margins are thin. They know the House is already teetering, and they know midterms are coming like a freight train. And in that environment, blind loyalty becomes a luxury they can't afford. And Trump's insistence on framing every disagreement as betrayal only accelerates the process because it leaves no room for nuance, no space for dissent, and no path for reconciliation, forcing lawmakers to choose between submission and independence. And increasingly, they are choosing independence even if they don't say it out loud yet. And this is why Trump's reaction oscillates between rage and denial, because admitting the truth would mean acknowledging that his power is conditional, that his influence is fading, and that the party he once bent to his will is beginning to imagine a future without him. And that future terrifies him more than any vote, any resolution, or any headline, because it means irrelevance. And Trump has always feared irrelevance above all else, which is why he doubles down on spectacle, on provocative statements about Greenland, on vague threats about military action, on rhetorical chest-thumping designed to project strength even as the foundations weaken. But those theatrics are losing their effect because lawmakers are no longer mistaking noise for authority. And as the Senate inches closer to a vote that could curtail his war powers, the stakes extend far beyond one policy outcome. Because a defeat here would signal that Trump's era of unchecked influence is ending, that Congress is rediscovering its spine, and that the Republican Party, fractured and bruised though it may be, is starting to ask the most dangerous question of all for a strongman leader. What happens after him? And once that question enters the room, it never leaves. It lingers, it spreads, and it reshapes behavior, because power doesn't disappear overnight. It erodes quietly at first, then all at once. And this moment, this revolt, this hesitation feels like the beginning of that erosion accelerating because Trump is no longer commanding the future. He's reacting to it. And reaction is the language of decline. This did not get enough attention. But did you see this? Look, headline, Congress is rejecting Trump's steep budget cuts to science lead. Congress is racing to undo thousands of cuts to federal science programs that President Trump called for last year. Trump is trying to cut the National Science Foundation 56%. Congress is now saying they will cut it less than 1%. Trump wanted to slash NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. You know, the weather. Congress's budget for NOAA is no cuts to NOAA. Flat funding for NOAA. Trump wants to cut basic research, which has been the lifeblood of American technological innovation since World War II. Trump wants to cut basic research more than 33%. Congress instead is bumping up the budget for basic research by more than 2%. Trump is demanding all these cuts to science, and Congress is saying no. And this is a bipartisan thing. This started in the Senate as a bipartisan agreement. Last week, the House voted for it as well. I know it's like muscle memory to assume that Congress does nothing, and B, if they ever defy that rule and do something, it's always something bad, because Trump has always relied on attention as a substitute for legitimacy. And when attention turns from awe to analysis, from spectacle to scrutiny, his power diminishes. And this loss of narrative control pushes Trump deeper into distraction politics, reviving old tactics like provocative foreign policy rhetoric, exaggerated security threats, and vague insinuations of decisive action, not because they're effective policy, but because they generate noise. And noise has always been Trump's shield against accountability. Yet even that shield is cracking because lawmakers, voters, and commentators are beginning to separate noise from consequence. And that separation is fatal for a political figure whose brand depends on conflating the two. And as this unfolds, the psychological fracture within MAGA becomes impossible to ignore because the movement that once revolved entirely around Trump's personality is now facing internal contradictions. It can no longer suppress contradictions between isolationism and interventionism, between anti-establishment rhetoric and authoritarian impulse, between populist messaging and elite-serving outcomes. And Trump has no answer to these contradictions because he never built MAGA to resolve them. He built it to serve himself. And now that the movement is being forced to confront real policy questions, Trump becomes an obstacle rather than a guide, a liability rather than a leader. And this is where figures like Thomas Massey's call to consider life without Donald Trump land with such force, because they articulate what many Republicans are thinking but haven't yet said out loud. That Trump's presence is no longer synonymous with victory, that his dominance no longer guarantees unity, and that clinging to him indefinitely may be the fastest path to irrelevance. And for Trump, this realization is catastrophic because his power has never come from ideology, organization, or institutional control. It has come from the belief that he is inevitable. And once that belief fades, once Republicans start planning for a post-Trump future, his leverage evaporates. And this is why the war powers revolt, the budget defeats, the bipartisan votes, and the ideological debates all converge into a single devastating narrative. Trump is no longer shaping events. He's being shaped by them, reacting rather than directing, scrambling rather than commanding. And that reversal marks a turning point because strong men don't fall when they lose elections. They fall when their supporters stop believing in their strength. And right now, that belief is eroding in real time, vote by vote, decision by decision, until what remains is not the towering figure Trump once projected, but a politician increasingly, boxed in by institutions he tried to dominate, by allies who no longer fear him, and by a party that is slowly, reluctantly, but unmistakably beginning to imagine a future where he is no longer at the center of everything.